Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the Occult Explorers. I'm Snappy, and I'm joined, as always, by my dear friend and co-host, Dion. How's it going, Dion?
Hello, hello, hello.
Life is beautiful, eh?
That's right.
Amazing. All right, so we are back with part two of our deep dive into the Gothic subculture. So, in part one, for those of you who need a recap, we had gone to where we believe the goth culture sort of kind of coalesces with the Batcave, and that English scene as well as the LA death rock scene. And now we are going back and tracing the roots of this subculture, which is, so permeated modern society. And we're trying to explore all the various ideas, characters, and things that make goth what it is today. Do you have anything to add to that, Dion?
Um, Alice Cooper, Elvis Presley, a plethora of musicians, artists, filmmakers
Right.
that are interested in the dark arts and
Screaming
how
Jay Hawkins.
Screaming Jay Hawkins, so many artists that it's not all about rock and roll or punk rock. You'll see that this fascination with the dark side is in every style of music. It could be
Absolutely.
classical, bluegrass, whatever.
This is one of the interesting things about the goth subculture as far as a lot of these modern subcultures are concerned. It's like, unlike heavy metal or punk, it's not so elitist in terms of the music, right? It doesn't have like a specific genre that it's obsessive with. There is like gothic rock and there is death rock, but you'll find goths in punk bands, you'll find goths in techno bands, in industrial. That it permeates everything. You have goths who aren't into music, they're into literature, right? It's such a broad subculture because its roots are more in an aesthetic and an approach to the dark side. It's about the dark side. It's not about the music, right? Where if you look at something like heavy metal, it's about that celebration of the music and the lifestyle in terms of that rock idea, right? Like it's all centered around the rock band. Whereas like you don't have that in goth, you know?
Yep, yep.
And it
You
has these
know,
deep connections to the occult. And there's also this weird spiritual bent to it all, right? And a lot of satanic panic and a reaction to, a reaction to satire. Oftentimes, what you see is when things are vilified, then people adopt them in order to cause a reaction. This is just something that we see time and time again. We talked about this in several episodes before. The Christians created the satanic panic. They manifested their own demons. People took up those guises and started practicing those rites out of fear and out of a desire to cause a reaction. And it would not have happened had they not been vilified, those ideas to begin with.
right, right. And I like that you said satire because
Right.
that pops up a lot. Because that'll pop up a lot in today's episode as well. Because that's one of the tools of, let's say, the dark artist.
Absolutely. And this seems to be so essential to goth, right? Like if we look at someone like we talked about, Bauhaus, who are kind of the quintessential goth rock band in some respect. And when you look at how they approach the sound and their aesthetic, it's both kitsch and tongue in cheek and a joke, but also deadly serious. Everything is thought out, everything is planned, everything has a reason. And sometimes that reason is just silly, but it's
Hmm.
all there, and it kind of creates this really interesting thing. Goth is both the Addams family and it is also Edgar Allan Poe. You can have both of these two things coalescing in one image.
Mm, I like that because they're included. Adam's family, Edgar Allan Poe. We'll definitely get into Poe today. Um,
Right. We talked
I,
briefly about Addams family, I think last episode. We mentioned them. Morticia,
yeah,
right?
um, that was a Morticia did a movie with Elvis before she was Morticia, and they
Right.
were played a romantic couple, I think, in the movie. Um, and one of the bands we didn't talk about last time, well, actually, a couple people we didn't talk about were the Pages, and we were
Right.
laughing about it earlier. Jimmy Page and Betty Page. which are both
Right.
iconic in this. So I think that's what we'll start with is with Jimmy Page.
We'll start with Jimmy Page for sure, because thank you to, I can't remember which user reminded us about Jimmy Page's connection,
Oh
but
yeah. Oh yeah.
it's clearly huge and important. Okay, oops, what's going on here? All right,
There you
and
go.
needs to be discussed. Here we go. Sorry, guys. So
And so
Jimmy
we
Page,
have
what do you
so
have to
what I was
say?
going to say is this picture right here, we'll start off with this Jimmy Page at his current residence, which was it's a castle. He was in a castle that was made by famous artist architect George Burgess, based off of 13th century. And there he is with his girlfriend Scarlett. And that's a fitting name, symbolic if you've seen any of our other episodes.
Right, the Scarlet Woman.
Yeah, huh?
Right.
And the castle's pretty creepy. If anybody knows about Jimmy Page's history, besides Led Zeppelin being the guitarist of a phenomenal band that's included in this, he's also wearing
Defining
a nice
band.
black suit there,
Right. Well, stuff.
part of the
Yeah.
theme.
I mean, we have to talk about Led Zeppelin because they're kind of, they're, heavy metal really gets its full package in Black Sabbath, right? They're the combination of all of the elements coming into one. But there are a couple of these proto bands which are just like bordering along the edges. And if these bands didn't, like, if they didn't reject the heavy metal label, no one would fault them for calling themselves metal. And that's bands like Led Zeppelin and like Deep Purple, right? That are really driving that push for a heavier, hard blues sound. But Led Zeppelin does also have a lot of this darker imagery. They don't go specifically into the satanic in the way that, you know, Black Sabbath does. They have all those Fear of Satan songs, but they do go into Lord of the Rings. They do go into a lot of this kind of mystical, fairy kind of stuff. A lot of their lyrics are really vague and open to interpretation, and they cultivated this deep rock star image, right? This grandiose hedonism and this powerful masculine, that becomes so quintessential in a lot of this kind of stuff, right? This rugged hedonism, individual, almost libertine type idea really permeates all of subculture, but definitely goth. And Led Zeppelin is right at the heart of all this.
I'm glad you said the word libertine, because that's one of the threads for today's episode as well. Because before there was goth, or let's say simultaneously, there's libertine, which is
Right.
connected to that. And so let's hit the next image. And that's the castle right there that he lives in his nice Gothic castle. But hit the next image. And this is here he is in front of a
Holstein
house
House.
that he bought in 1970. And he owned it from 1970 to 1992.
Yeah, wasn't it recently? I think it's recently been torn down, but this was the Boleskine House, one of Crowley's residences, and where he attempted to perform the magic of Abramelin the Mage. He tried to do this grand initiation for himself here. He didn't fully commit. Infamously, that particular magical rite takes several months of dedicated practice, and Crowley never finished. But Page was deeply interested in the occult, specifically in Thelema, and has this kind of connection where he bought Boleskine House. He was deeply influenced by Crowley and by this idea of magic and the do what thou wilt type of philosophy.
Oh, yeah. It's not a particularly awesome looking house. So he
No.
bought it for symbolic value of what it
Right.
connects him to. And he bought it in 1970. That's quite early in his
Right.
journey, in their journey. So he was already messing about that early, let's say.
Right.
So, and that's how, so now we'll go with the theme of what we had on if you saw the thumbnail, the bride wore black or the man wore black. And we'll start here around the same time period, 1970. Johnny Cash releases an album called The Man Wore Black or The Man in Black. And in this one, I like it because look at his riding boots.
Right.
Those ain't fishing boots. Those are like European riding boots with his with this neat sweater on,
Right.
looking very European aristocracy, let's say.
But he's
Um,
also putting on this scowl, and he has that quintessential masculine 50s haircut, you know? So it's
oh
like,
yeah,
it's interesting.
uh,
And, you know,
and
go ahead.
I was going to say he had a nickname. They called him the Undertaker. The rest of the country bands, when he would show up to perform, they go, "Oh, there's the Undertaker."
Right. You know, well, Johnny Cash was very much like cultivated. He was interesting because you got to remember he's coming at this at such an early place in terms of like um what was acceptable, and he was really pushing the, you know, country music had grown out of folk music and separated and really kind of, you know, there's that dividing line where it's a very political line, you know. Folk music is becomes a more northern thing, becomes a thing associated with the hippies, whereas country music is very much southern, it's very much connected to conservatism, it's very much connected to Americana, and he's existing in this world, right? And he manages to rebel and start the whole outlaw country thing. Now, of course, there have always been these kind of outlaw figures, but he is the one who takes this and crafts himself an image. You know, you can look at other earlier country superstars like what's that guy's name? The king of country. I can't think of his name, but
Well, hit the
you know,
next image while you're talking,
Hank
though.
Williams. Hank Williams, right? Hank Williams is kind of the quintessential outlaw, but Cash turns it into a whole persona, right? He's the one who goes to Folsom Prison, and there's all these myths about him, and he's not really a bad guy, but his image preceded him, and people saw him as that, like you said, this Undertaker figure, this somber figure, right? And he even brings this out in his music. One of the really interesting and powerful things about him is that he has this deep baritone voice, and he always goes for the lower harmony, something that you don't see very often in pop music. So you take all of this, right? He has this conservative, ultra rugged, individualist male outlaw kind of thing, and he's in this deeply conservative industry where he's rebelling while still performing within it. It's radical for its time, you know, and it starts, so many people follow in his footsteps and take this kind of radical outlaw thing even further.
Oh yeah, and, in this image, it's right before he's getting ready to go on stage at Folsom Prison.
Right. And
So,
that's
and they
one of the
loved him.
most important like that live record is incredible, right? And like think about how interesting and radical that is. Like the way all of these things, artists weren't really doing this, especially within country. You know, he's purposely going and performing at a prison, right? He's dressing in black, uh, really emphasizing this outlaw kind of thing, singing songs about prison and, you know, wanting to come home from the war, right? Things that were very controversial in 50s, 60s America, you know?
Mm. So you know what? Last week we talked about Teddy Boys
Right,
in the 60s, and their outfits and this rebellious nature of this rock and roll movements that spawned different subgenres.
right.
Um, and one of these other genres, if you hit the next image, yeah, there it is, Le Blousons Noirs, the Black Jackets. Yeah, the Black
Gotcha.
Jackets from France. Um, Rock and roll, rebels, smoking cigarettes, breaking windows, riding little motorbikes. And this is a French version that got very popular. And they're French rebels
Amazing.
in black
Born
jackets.
bad. I love
And
that.
like, go to the next image, and you can see it reminds me of a leather daddy. That's why I had to include it, because this is some of the prototypes. This is how they dress. The streets of France.
Well, we gotta talk about this a bit, you know, because this is also happening in the UK as well. You have the Teddy Boys, which is the more fashion forward, but you have the harder and the original rockers, right? And they were all driving around on their Triumph motorcycles, and it was this reaction to World War II, right? It was a reaction of coming out of the post-war years where they were kind of, you know, the military leather kind of look is scary and terrifying, and there's this freedom associated with the biker image, and there's that rebelliousness that's associated with this, and this really grows out of this whole, out of World War II, and then later with the Vietnam War, it really takes off. And that's when
Right.
you get the true establishment of the biker subculture as we know it today, right? In both goth and heavy metal, all of these subcultures are definitely are very influenced by biker, but biker is a bit different, because
Right.
because we got to talk about this, because we've
Like
been talking
Easy
about
Rider biker.
subcultures, right? We've been talking about subcultures. And subculture exists within culture. They're niche movements associated with art, usually around youths, but they may be reactionary, but they are not existing outside of it. They're not trying to completely subvert it. There are some elements of this, like some elements of punk, some elements of heavy metal, but biker's different. It is a counterculture. It is not a subculture, it's a counterculture. They're deeply reactionary movement, and they set up their own sort of world, right? They're in organized crime often. At least, I mean, you do have, like, this is the weird thing again. You have this element of biker that becomes mainstreamed, that becomes acceptable, especially in modern times. But the original biker was a counterculture movement. And this is also why it's so powerful of an image. Again, there's this satire thing. It's kind of funny nowadays, right? When we see these, ex-lawyers and ex-doctors with their $100,000-$200,000 Harleys and their long beards and their hair, and you're like, you guys are trying to be something from the 70s, but those guys were all vets, and those guys were real criminals, like a lot of them.
Right. As well as the soldiers that came back from World War II had no jobs, nothing to do, had a little bit of an adrenaline rush, and wanted to got on a motorcycle and like, gee, this is fun.
Yeah.
And so not all of it was, not everybody's outlaw biker, that 1%er.
Right.
And there were, like I was saying, Peter Fonda, that was Easy Rider, if I remember. And there's a whole biker culture, but there's different subgenres of biker culture. So hit the next image.
Yeah.
I had this record as a kid. Everyone had this. A lot of kids had this record. YMCA, the Village People.
Right.
But I didn't know what that meant as a kid.
Yeah.
I didn't know what that meant. I thought he was just the guy in black. You had an Indian, a construction worker. I didn't know what Leather Daddy meant. That's a sub genre, and this is influenced goth. This is part of the dark arts
culture. It's part of BDSM culture, and it has some seriously deep roots. Cruising, of course. This is such a
Al
ridiculous.
Pacino.
This is also part of that whole, queer exploitation films, right? Where you have these, like, the whole thing is he's flirting with homosexuality while trying to catch people, in the acts of in homosexual acts to arrest them. It's ridiculous, but it's, goth is very much this libertine movement that accepts sexuality and is very sex forward and very queer positive, right? Like from its origin. So to see it accepting, BDSM and queer elements is that's where the goth is coming from in many ways.
Exactly. Right? And the wearing of black. And this goes back to the World War II outfits, and even farther back, because that's what part of the theme is. The man who wore black, the bride who wore black. So hit the next image.
So we got to talk about the creator of all of this. This is the most influential queer, or at least gay, homoerotic artist of all time, Tom of Finland. And Tom of Finland, he drew a lot of these originally for 1950s male fitness magazines, right? That's where he got his start in the 50s and the 60s, drawing pinups for these kind of male bodybuilders. But he always had a more homoerotic edge. And then eventually, as his career took off, he became a private artist who specialized in homoerotic imagery. And he invented the gay leather daddy, right? This is something that first existed in Tom of Finland's mind and then became realized in reality. You do not get the Village People without Tom of Finland. And we, and we got to see where a lot of this, it's a reaction to, so much of Thomas Finland's work is about recasting homosexuality in a hyper masculine and a hyper power sense. After World War II, so much of homosexuality become all about the sissy, right? In mainstream culture, the only homosexual men you see would be the sissy or the evil sissy, and they would be shamed on TV regularly, right? So there was this strong pushback in the 50s and the 60s among queer men to reject all of that sissification, right? They wanted to be these true empowered outlaws. And Tom saw in the biker subculture that freedom, that power, and made it erotic, turned it into something hyper sexual. And then it became a realized, there are still leather clubs all across the world. You'll still see people dressed up like this regularly at pride parades. It's beyond celebrated, it's iconic now, right? And we have to talk about another sexual performer who's just as iconic as Tom of Finland, and that is, of course, Betty Page, the other Page we forgot to mention.
Another pinup artist, another poster. So what they are both idolized, perfected versions of the breaking boundaries of the female and the male, highly sexualized Betty Page.
Right. And Betty Page was a burlesque performer, a BDSM performer, on the fringes of pop culture. She became really popular in pinup posters and in postcards, right? And her image has become so iconic. You see it reflected in modern goth to this day. You look at someone like Kat Von D, and their image couldn't exist without taking cues from Betty Page. And, she was the brunette who had that kind of fierce attitude and would engage in this kind of erotic, dominant, femdom type stuff, right? Again, we're just like we see with the Tom of Finland, where it's that hyper masculine, hyper strong. We're seeing it at her. That's this hyper strong, empowered feminine, right? That becomes so eroticized. It's really
and
interesting.
Part of that, I was going to say, is the wearing of black.
Yeah. The black hair, right? And the black leather, and really interesting stuff.
So here, this outfit, 1840s, Count Magnus. This is a mourning outfit that a count wore to Wilhelm funeral. A Kaiser, I think it was not the Kaiser, it was if he was a Kaiser yet, his funeral in Germany. And it's all leather. And this is in a museum right now. And that's a mourning outfit. It has a robe, a cape. It has power. And that's why it's even without the person, it has power, just the outfit itself. What satyr is that the term satyr magic? The robe?
Yes,
the
satyr,
black robe at that. And so hit the next image.
Well, satyr magic, that's getting into Norse stuff. I'm not, but
like a blanket or a robe, but I think it's the idea of a piece of fabric, of using cloth,
right,
to do.
We do have all this stuff about the wizard's cloak, and if people are interested in the wizard's cloak, you should check out our friend Wretch wrote a whole section of his book on that particular image, the Kabbalic antecedents. But what we see with the wizard cloak, right, is often it would be this, a fumigation thing where you would be using it to fumigate various herbs and entheogens. And on your cloak, you would have the stars of various constellations and sigils that you would be trying to project and invoke inside your mind's eye. So there's some wild stuff with a lot of that in outfits.
Another way of explaining it to people, hotboxing, they didn't roll up joints back in the day. They would light a fire and put the herbs on the fire and put a giant blanket over it in hotbox.
Yep. And they
like
would do that with these cloaks. Yep.
Yeah. That was one of the techniques.
Would also do astrological tapestries, right? For imagination. Just wild stuff.
So hit the next image. And so right here, the idea of that black robe, top left corner, the witch, Hecate, the black robe. even without the person, just seeing that, I see the image, I know what it is. Below that, a burqa, that's in Islam, that they force women to wear. And it deals with power both ways. It deals with the controlling of power or the gaining of power. Because next to that, the black robe is a priest's robe, or a judge's robes,
or an executioner's hood.
Yeah, or that's called a chaperone from the 1400s, and a fool could wear that, or executioner. Dracula's robe, right? That's the backside of Dracula. You recognize it because the turned up collar, aristocracy. Some of the vampire myths come out of French aristocracy, them leeching off the people. And then the one to the right is a mourning robe, Victorian mourning outfit that a woman would have to wear. And there's all these rules on mourning. Sometimes you had to wear it for 2 years, 1 year, 6 months.
And we need to talk about mourning magic, right? Because this is like, when we're talking about the Greco-Roman magical tradition, this is the root of the Greco-Roman magical tradition. If you look at the story of Demeter, the whole idea of the mourning and the breaking of mourning is essential to the entire story, right? After the Corey is abducted, she goes into this fit of mourning, Demeter, where she comes down to earth and is in this wandering stage until she finally comes to Eleusis. And she only breaks her mourning after she's made to laugh, right? After she's made to laugh, and then she breaks in bread and has a feast. And that's when she produces the kykeon, right? The kykeon literally comes out after the mourning is broken. And there's all this stuff about it's not until Demeter's mourning is broken that the Corey can even return. And that mourning magic transforms the seasons. And we see this theme again and again and again. You're supposed to cry out in loving adoration to bring that energy back, to make the dead rise again. They would have all of these really intense rites around mourning. Women and men would be encouraged, like we saw in later times with those black robes. But this is something that goes all the way back to ancient Greece, where they would engage in, multiple days of mourning, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. In fact, this is such a prevalent thing. A lot of scholars, if you look at Delphi, they have these inscriptions all around Delphi, and many of these become Delphic maxims, right? And one of the most important Delphic maxims is about not overly indulging in these kind of things, not to be excessively mourning, to excessively, because it's such a common thing, right?
Yep. I mean, and in my mind, I see a priest, I see a judge, a witch. They're in mourning. They're in mourning. They got the black robes on. That's why they got the power of life and death over you to decide.
The crossroads into that liminal space, right?
Mm-hmm. And putting on the black and then doing a ritual. That's what you're talking about, doing these ancient mystery rites. So let's hit the next image. Here's Joyce Mansour, and this is in 1959. We're going to talk about them doing a ritual, wearing black and doing a ritual. And in ancient times, it was a mystery rite. But in 1959, it was performance art. If you could hit the next image. And this is the artist Jean Benoit. And he's known as the Enchanter of Serpents, if you look him up. And in 1959, they put on a piece in Paris where he dressed up in this elaborate costume. Hit the next image even. Shows it better. There you go.
It's terrifying.
And what would happen during the mystery rite, they stripped him of this outfit piece by piece until underneath, all he had on was a wooden phallus. And a series of arrows pointed on his body, pointing to his heart, above his heart and his chest, where he branded the word Sade.
Sade.
And it was
Sade, Marquis de Sade.
Did I say Sade? I'm sorry. I like Sade's music.
You're going back to pop music.
And so, and he branded Desaad. He branded Desaad right there, where they get the term sadism from in BDSM. And he did it as a performance ritual mystery, right? To free the Marquis's soul, to liberate him from his own bondage. And there's multiple levels of it. And so go to the next image. And this was the part they put out invites that had the wax seal on it to intellectuals in France. And they even did art in a book dedicated to the performance. And it was called the Execution?
Execution of the Testament of Marquis de Sade.
Yeah, yeah. And the riffing off Marquis de Sade doing performance art. Go to the next image. I want to talk about this guy too. This is right here, Colin Woolrich. And he came up with the series of books back in the day that were all dedicated to the art of black. One was called The Bride Wore Black, The Black Angel, The Black Curtain. There was a whole bunch of them. And go to the next image. You can see some of the books there. And these are titles in the 40s about wearing black or about black themes. And go to the next one. And we'll skip through those and go, boom, go to the next one. All right. Yeah, here we are. Good to Antonin Artaud. Because I know you've done several episodes about this guy.
Oh, yeah. Graham and I are kind of obsessed with Antonin Artaud.
Right. And so the reason I brought him up is because he fits into it multiple ways. One is that he used to wear black a lot, and he was famous for wearing black. People would say, "Oh, there's the guy in black." He invented something called the theater of the cruel. If you can hit the next image,
Theater
I think I got a
theater
of cruelty, and it was about confronting our perceptions of art and boundaries of emotion, and I know you know a lot about him, but
yeah, he really wanted to explore. He wanted people to push the boundaries, and he wanted to return to an authentic theater that we see in the Dionysian tradition. Right? He wanted to have theater that would lead to true magical realization, that would obliterate the false culture. Right? He saw so much of our reality and so much of our world as kind of like this evil force that was, dominating us and controlling us. And he saw the theater specifically as this way to destroy the body and create what he termed the body without organs, right? To lead to this apotheosis where you become this transcendent version of the self that is no longer bound to the physical world. And he wanted to recreate this kind of magic within the modern theater. We have to understand, Antonin Artaud was coming out of the French theater, which at this time had become deeply, deeply conservative and high art. And he was rejecting all of that. He wanted to break these fourth walls down. He wanted to be in the audience. He wanted audience participation. He almost even didn't want language. He wanted people to be just expressing their deepest, rawest emotion. And a lot of this was him teaching lectures and teaching people about theater. He didn't do too many performances, but several, such as this one, but he was so radically influential. He was a huge influence upon the Surrealist movement and on theater, probably one of the defining theatrical philosophers or people who thought about theater ever,
Mm-hmm.
But his whole thing was this kind of, he was really into this occultism and really into, it was somewhat Gnostic, somewhat deeply connected to the cult of Attis, and somewhat Christian, but all about this reaction and rejection of modern culture, a rejection of the world, a rejection of the self, and this trying to achieve this returning to a primal reality, a primal humanity, one that was not distorted by the weight of history and society and culture, one that could perceive reality as it is. Really wild character. Yeah.
Well, you said he had influence, and so here I'm going to illustrate some of his influence. If you can hit the next image, here he is in a 1927 film Napoleon, where he plays Marat, who's murdered in the bathtub by a woman. in this famous scene, which went on to influence other artists as well. And it deals with Marquis de Sade. If you hit the next image. Oh, okay. Before that, I want to show you this. This is another artist right here. This is Man Ray. Who was an artist in the 30s, along with Marcel Duchamp. And
Data. Okay.
Yeah. That's why I wanted to include them. Just the image got put in sooner. It got mixed up. So that's why it skipped to that. So that's why I'm skipping to Dada right here. Surrealism and Dada, avant-garde. Because we're talking about like Antonin Artaud. And
you got to talk a bit about this, because like those surrealism was all about the returning to one's dreams and engaging in this kind of occulted magic. Like it comes out of people like Andre Breton, right? And they were creating types of sigil magic and abstract magic, but they were influenced by this earlier people who were into Dada, and Dada was, an absolute reactionary movement. Everyone is kind of well familiar at this point with Marcel Duchamp, The Fountain, right? Which began this kind of, anything can be art. It was challenging, and it was all about rejecting people's perceptions and rejecting the rules and stuff. He made a urinal, cast it, signed it Armut, a ridiculous pseudonym, and then placed it in this museum and said, "This is the greatest piece of art ever made." And people just freaked the hell out because they didn't know what to do with this, because it was just so reactionary, but this was all about, like, this was that time, right, where Antonin Artaud was doing in the theater what the Dadaists were doing in the museums, right? What they were doing to classical art. But there's also a deep magical bent to this as well, right? Dada, right? What are we getting at? This is a primal sound. They were trying to go back to the roots of human culture. Just like Artaud, they were trying to break free of all of this weight, all of this perception, all of this detritus that was informing our reality, all the propaganda. And they wanted to return to something that was pure and human. Dada is the word for father. It's that primal babble. And this is very much a magical invocation that we see throughout the Western magical tradition, right? We have, for example, the goddess Tacita, the goddess of silence. One of her secret names in Ovid is Lala, right? And this is, like, again, connected to that primal call of the mother, So there's so much going on with all of this. And these artists, right? We got to remember, these are the most deeply well-read, deeply thoughtful people who are trying to reshape and create their reality,
Well, let's scroll through a couple of pics so I can illustrate some of that. And here's another image from Man Ray that looks very Gothic. Go to the next image, please. There's a Marcel. Did you know that Marcel had an alter ego? And that's Rose.
Oh, wow. That's Marcel Duchamp.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting. I didn't know that.
Yep. And he put out a series of works, even a perfume with him and Man Ray teamed up.
Wow. He had a feminine alter ego.
Yeah. I never knew that. And I came across it and was like, yep. And they did it. He did it as an art performance at that, and put out artworks dedicated to this character, Rose. And
how interesting.
It's part of the performance art. It's shape-shifting. It's dealing with your body is the canvas at that. And so let's hit the next image.
And creating of the self.
Because at that time, because where we're at right now is the 30s. And we have theater, we have Antonin Artaud, you have Dada, Surrealism, Bauhaus is part of what we're talking about, which is a movement where Bauhaus gets their name from. It's an artistic movement.
Architectural school from Germany, but it's more of this architectural movement, this return to these kind of straight lines, and really interesting.
And the usage of black and white. That's what we see in a lot of this, is the usage of color is stripping things down to their primal elements. Here's a movie from 1922 that's influential, because part of it is the German movement is a big part of this. And this is Nosferatu. And
Right.
this is pretty gothic right here.
We have to
This
talk a
is that
bit for a
blue-
second about the whole bohemian thing, because this is an interesting thing. We have in our mind, in our current reality, this conception, of Germany, that it was this deeply, deeply conservative place, right? Especially pre-World War II, but that's not the case at all. It was a deeply conflicted place, right? Like a deeply divided place. And while there was certainly that conservative element that rose to power, there was also this deeply, deeply um, on the other side element, right? You had the whole bohemian movement was this free love, queer, female forward kind of movement that was happening in Germany, right? You also had the such a strong push for socialism in Germany at this time, and you had all of this um, film movement at this time, right? They were at the cusp of all of this. So we have to remember that, yes, while Germany did become this fascist place, in the 30s, it was not fully realized. And there was this deeply, deeply reactionary movement to all of that, right?
It was popping off in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And there's so many authors, artists, playwrights, and that were influenced by it to this day. Everything gets demonized because of the next 10 or 20 years after that.
Right.
But if we can go to the next image, because that's even right here. Here's another image. This is from the
Cabinet
Bauhaus
of
album. But this is the original image where it comes from, and this is from the cabinet of Dr.
Dr.
Caligari.
Caligari. Yeah. This is
Um,
okay. This is such an influential film in terms of its set design, its costuming. You can see the influence of this movie in anything that Tim Burton has ever done, especially like The Nightmare Before Christmas. So much of its aesthetic form and the way, it does these distorted windows, these really bright lights and super intense contrast. A lot of that was just the nature of film at that time. In order to be properly seen on film, they had to douse themselves in this white makeup and these really, uh, so these artists who were engaged in this exploited that color contrast and the tools they had at the time, and they created this deeply wild uh, imagery, this expressionist film that's still radical to this day and still influence. It's so far reaching in terms of its form. It's probably the most influential horror film ever created, just because of the artistic weight that it has had on popular culture. And most of us have never seen it.
right. Yeah, this is from the 1920s. He
Right.
also did Tale of a Vampire. Let's hit the next image. Here's another famous image. This is from 1916, and this is from a movie called Les Vampires, Les Vampires, French movie, but it's about a group of thieves that use thieves' cant. That's even part of the movie, thieves' cant. They speak in that language in the original script in the book, and this is called Les Vampires. And look how iconic that is.
Wow. This clearly informs Batman, right?
Yeah. And this is 1916. And at the same time, as this is going on, go to the next image. Where was it at? Zurich? I think it's in Zurich. It's a Cabaret Voltaire, the real Cabaret Voltaire, the club. It was a club. Hugo Ball opened a club in 1916. And that's where Dada and all these artists would get together. And this is the avant-garde. This is the world of change. And they use satire to address politics. They use brutalism to address art. They deconstructed things. They used a cathartic release. They explored their own shadows. This is about confrontation of what you think art is.
Right.
And also Cabaret Voltaire becomes an iconic band years later. That's electronic. If you're into electronica, then you've heard of Cabaret Voltaire.
Right. Or if you're just into goth.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And at that same time, they also had the vamp concept. Besides a vampire, like in the 1920s, if a woman was sultry and seductive, she was a vamp.
Right.
That was another
I know
term.
that they use this a lot. Well, that was a lot also used for lesbians as well, right? Like a
Hmm.
lot of that queer kind of empowered female was vilified, and some of the earliest vampire novels were really about lesbians. Like, what was
All
that
right.
book? I'm sure you're going to bring it up, but it predates
Oh, that's
Dracula.
Carmilla. That's Carmilla.
Carmilla,
Yeah, that's in the
yeah,
next week's episode.
right. We'll
And
get
that's
into
one of the
that.
first vampire books. Is a lesbian vampire novel, Gothic. Um, Even before Dracula, you had the Phantom of the Opera, Gaston Leroux,
Right.
and that's another Gothic figure. But
We also
right
have to
here,
talk about Lord Byron, right? The
yeah,
vampire. He
yeah,
writes a
yep, he did a
vampire book.
vampire one too. Here we have 1897, Bram
Mhm.
Stoker. This is kind of like where modern culture thinks the vampire myth begins, but it's obviously much older than this. But here it's like this is like the Batcave 1982 is Bram Stoker 1897.
You know,
Dracula
there are
rears his head every now and then.
well, there are popular books, and then there's Dracula, right? This caused a sensation that we are still reverberating from, you know, uh, almost all these years later. It's incredible how popular this book became and how much of a stranglehold it's had on popular culture. And it's interesting because when you go and you read it, it's kind of a struggle to read in some ways because it's very much a mystery done through it's like a found footage film in novel form, right? Everything is told through scraps, through diary entries and little things. It's like someone assembled the story after the fact through the literature of all the people who are involved. It's a really, really interesting book, but like Dracula himself is like this weird monster who's barely he features in the film, but he's kind of the more of this backdrop kind of figure, and it's very much about nobility, and very like we have what's interesting to me is that the kind of film and everything kind of creates this romantic image of the vampire that then becomes the dominant idea, right? So much of our modern conception of the vampire, especially in the post Twilight years, is this beautiful, empowered, energy, right? The most beautiful, the most seductive. But like Dracula is not seductive, you know, not in that sense. He's not coming to offer you power. He's coming to destroy and wreck your mind. He's coming to eat your women, right? He's a leech upon society. He's like this decrepit old imperial of a bygone era,
With the
right?
turned up collar and the black robe.
It's far more about anti-nobility. There isn't this vampire seduction, right? That comes with film, I believe, right? That and with some later novels. Or
Mm.
I mean, we do see the seduction element in Camilla. So it's almost like if you took Camilla and Dracula and merged them, then you get more of our modern concept.
Right. Well, at the same time that Bram Stoker put that out, they were also make this because it's a pre-film, 1897, turn of the century. The theater was raging at this time, along with the art movement. And theater at this time. All right, go to the next image.
Oh, I also just want to talk about one interesting thing too, is that
Mhm.
we had brought up way back here Nosferatu, right? And Nosferatu was originally written as as an interpretation of Dracula, but they couldn't get the rights from Bram Stoker's widow. She
Mhm.
refused, and she
She sued him.
famously
She
sued.
sued.
She sued to the point where they had destroyed the vast majority of copies, and then this was refound years later and restored. Like we almost lost the movie because of Bram Stoker and that capitalist ridiculousness, or the Bram Stoker estate, I should say. But yeah.
Right, right. So 1897. All right, because we're out of the Puritan ages where theater was controlled and you had to be Shakespearean and you had to hide everything and
Theater
the
became
church.
high at this time, right? which Anton Artaud then later tries to break from. But this
Yeah,
is
yeah.
when it's becoming high art.
So during that time in France, you had it's called phantasmagoria. It's a type of
Yeah.
theater, and here's the Grand
Loads.
Goujonot, and they would stage theatrical performances like horror shows. It's like a modern horror show where blood would squirt out, ghosts would move across the stage. It was
Well, and
mechanical
also
prop.
it's really interesting because so much of the so much we got a comment here from Magic Magazine. Um let's give it a read here. You see
Oh
my
yeah,
comment about the Church of England owning the book Dracula and making it the second most read book of all. I didn't know that. So thank you for sharing us with that. Well, and I'm glad that you're sharing.
copyrights. They're sued
Great
for
to
that
see you.
thing. That thing had legal battles in the English courts.
No wonder it's so popular. It's been promoted by the Church of England. Oh my gosh. But yeah,
Keep you in line and scare you.
thanks for that, Shay. That's beautiful, and thank you so much for the donation. Really, really appreciate your support. You know, those phantasmagoria things. There's a deep occult element here. So a lot of it is, magic, stage magic. A lot of it is born out of stage magic and then brought into the theater. And the idea was to trying to create these intimate performances. And you would have a lot of early film stuff where they would use projectors and they would use smoke, but they weren't just like it wasn't just that. In his book 420, Liber 420, Chris Bennett talks about this quite extensively. A lot of these phantasmagoria shows, like this is low art. This is like, for the public and was run by a lot of really shady characters. And they would do things like fumigate the theater with cannabis in order to make people have a more terrified experience. And like this is documented. And a lot of this phantasmagoria stuff, like these, this is where also the occult comes in too, because at the same time, at this point, you have this massive burst of what becomes the whole spiritualism movement is happening at this time, right?
Right. Yeah, the
Seances and
seances and the
talking to the
mediums.
dead. And we have to remember how huge this was. This was such a mainstream phenomenon. It later becomes the Theosophical Society, or it informs the Theosophical Society, becomes one of the most important religious movements of our time. This was even people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a proponent of spiritualism, right? And
And
so these
mind you,
themes were
Houdini
everywhere.
went around debunking them
Yes.
because they were using stage magic. He saw
Yep.
what they were doing. He's like, you guys are using props.
Well, Houdini is really interesting because he's also kind of an occultist in his own right, but he was debunking the fake and the fraudsters. He was really mad about people who were pretending to speak to the dead. And this became a huge thing. And it's kind of wild now in this, we have this kind of like both sides claim Houdini. The skeptics claim Houdini and the occultists claim Houdini,
Right.
right? Who Houdini actually is somewhere in between, a really wild character in his own right, and hugely, hugely important. But yeah, all of this phantasmagoria is early filmmaking. It's where early filmmaking, stage performance, and the occult all kind of merge.
And they're taking Gothic novels and staging them.
Yep.
It's fumigating the theater, getting you high and putting
Yep.
stuff in your mead and your drinks. And it's 4D. It's what when we go see 4D now, that was 4D then. But let's hit the next image. You had another club in Paris, Le Chat Noir club, the Black Cat. And this is where you get intellectuals together, artists. They drink absinthe. Even like the Hellfire clubs, these are like salons, but this is in France where it's taken a twist. Where, like you're saying, performance art, where now you want to embody the stuff you're reading. You get tired of just reading. Now you want to make it come to life. That's how we got film. Right. 50 years later after this, there's film and there's radio, there's sound. It's because these intellectuals brought it to life. They took what they got high, they looked at the paper and they started performing and they go, let's manifest this, let's make it. And then technology, turn of the century, gave them the gadgets to do it. Electricity, moving pictures and sound. and
Beautiful.
they brought the mystery to life, let's say.
Yep. Wild stuff.
So next image, and this will help inform a lot of what they're doing at this time, because this is 1896, the same time they're doing um, Bram Stoker novels. A year before, A.E. Waite released the manual for Satanism.
We
Some
also
will
got to
say
tell,
this
yeah,
this is
like,
supposed to be against Satanism, and this is for Christians, fellow Christians, but it seems more like an instruction manual for pagans.
so this is ridiculous because, okay, so we've talked about this book several times. This becomes one of the most infamous books in modern culture. It's a spark of a satanic panic. A spark of a satanic panic. It started as satanic panic when it was released, and then 50 years or how many ever years later, it helps inform the satanic panic that happens in the US in the 80s, right? Really, really wild stuff. But this book, what's so funny is it's largely a reaction to two specific books. Um, so A.E. Waite is one of the most influential occultists of all time, but we have to put him in his right context. He is a deeply Christian man who is involved in Western magic, but from that Christian lens. And he was very much against a lot of this left-handed path type stuff that was happening. He's really hugely important for, of course, creating the most popular tarot deck along with the artist Pamela Coleman Smith, and coming out of the Golden Dawn and not revealing their secrets in the way that Crowley and others did. But he was also, I think, his greatest contribution to the history of magic is actually in translation, where he translated the History of Magic by Alpheus Levi. And so most of this book is actually a reaction to Levi and to Levi's magic, right? And Levi was constantly raging against anarchist spooks and what he believed to be he was also a deeply Catholic communist and was really against these more libertine occult ideas and was constantly raging against them in his literature. And this informs A.E. Waite. And A.E. Waite is also reacting to another novel at this time, which is called Labat, and that came out in 1891 by J.K. Huysman. And this kind of has the quintessential satanic Black Mass, at least in terms of like its literary performance and how we come to perceive it in our culture. It really happens with J.K. Huysman. And this is a fiction story. It's about a guy who decides to go and explore the satanic, to explore. He becomes obsessed with, we had talked about in previous episodes, what was her name? Lavoisin, right? The
Affair of the
infamous,
Poison.
yeah, the infamous mob boss in Paris, who from, I'm trying to remember when she was around, but we'll get into her in the next episode. But she would actually engage in these performances of a satanic mass, but it was all about bilking the rich nobility out of their money. And it was this whole giant performance about, again, you create a taboo. Now you've created the desire to recreate the taboo. You say that this is an evil thing that will empower people. Now people are going to do it seeking power. And you're going to get weirdos who will exploit the people who want it. And that's really what happened with La Voisin, right?
It,
You know,
well, it,
so
it it happened in the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s.
so A.E. Waite is a huge piece of garbage. We got to say this, right? And this book, again, it's reacting to fiction, and it's reacting to a deeply angry communist, misogynist Catholic in Alpheus Levi and creating a satanic other.
Right.
And this informs satanic panics of the later years.
Right. Well, so at that time, A. Wade had a lot of to draw from, a lot of novels and literature that are libertine, dark, gothic, what he considers satanic. Go to the next image. And even before I go to Charles Baudelaire, um, in 1890, Oscar Wilde came out with Pictures of Dorian Gray.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's some
That
wild
was
stuff.
that one is gothic. That one is
Yeah.
very gothic. And Oscar Wilde, if you know
Charlemagne.
about Oscar Wilde's life, he was persecuted too. He couldn't release. He had to release some of his books in different countries. They
He
wanted to
was
throw him in
imprisoned
jail.
for
Yeah,
homosexuality, right? He wrote some of his most famous work on toilet paper, right? Like similar to Marquis de Sade, actually, like,
right, right,
while in
right.
prison,
Yeah,
yeah, like, and this is it's such a sad story, Oscar Wilde's story. But you're right, he's a huge part of this. Um, those plays that he created were so reactionary and were so empowering the feminine, empowering the other, empowering there was this queer underpinning to everything he was doing as well, that was only there for people who had the ears to hear, so to speak.
got him in trouble. Got him in trouble.
Got him in deep
So,
trouble.
and this artist you know about,
Of course,
The
Baudelaire.
Flowers of Evil. He released
Le
something called The Flowers
Mal.
of Evil, the Fleur de Mal. And it contains a vampire story in there.
Yeah.
A classic, and he wore black too, and he was a brooding character. Maybe you want to talk about Charles a little bit.
So Charles Baudelaire is such a wild man. He was the biggest fangirl in human history for Edgar Allan Poe. Absolutely obsessed with Poe. Never got to meet Poe in his lifetime, but he translated Poe into French. But he didn't just translate him into French. He made some people believe that he improved upon Poe stuff. Like his translations are so celebrated within the French language, it's ridiculous, and they had such a reverberating impact. So not only was he hugely influential in his own right as a poet, but he was equally influential as a translator of the poetry and stories of Edgar Allan Poe. And he was a deeply macabre fellow. This was a guy who was really he was a libertine. He had his own muse. He kind of lived this, at this time you had a lot of these artists. I'm trying to remember, they called them, there were these young men, there was all of these young affluent men at the turn of the revolution who were creating art. They were, he was famously an art critic, and he spent his time getting drunk and stoned in cafes, writing about art and sleeping with prostitutes. That's Charles Baudelaire's life. But he also was just a wild innovator of poetry. He would take these deeply macabre images and make them beautiful. And for him, this was a magical act, a performance of recreation. And a lot of this was inspired through opium dreams. And he was deeply connected to a lot of this. There was this whole opium club that was also happening at this time. And a lot of these occultists, you get famously the guy who wrote The Three Musketeers was a part of this same group,
Sure,
Alexander
sure.
Dumas, you know and there's a lot of these writers who were deeply involved in this, like,
Salon.
we really got to talk about, like, at this point the libertine movement has kind of reached, it's dying out and it's reached this apex. But there's throughout, beginning in the Renaissance, you have this whole development of this libertine sensibility, right? That kind of permeates all throughout Europe, but especially French culture, where you have these figures who are of the nobility, who are in this pursuit of the left-handed path type magic, in the pursuit of the extremes of human decadency. And you get people like Marquis de Sade is kind of the quintessential libertine, who, his name informs sadism, but his whole ideology was this: might is right. Whoever has the strength can do whatever they want, and the universe is our plaything, and that we have to go and brutalize it. And they were all interested in this idea of death and the destruction of the self as this form of erotic liberation. We see this in the philosophy of George Bataille, right, which comes after, but it's clearly hidden within a lot of these libertine, noble things, right? And it's wild. At the same time, you're getting humanism from these characters. You're also getting the extremes of decadence and a lot of this wild, dark magic.
Well, part of that is they have a budget. Some of the ones that have a budget, or they would patronize some of these artists and give them a budget. And earlier in the 14, 15, and 16s, 17s, that's the alchemy scene. That's where you have the fake alchemists going around to the different courts. And
Right.
later on, people don't believe in that anymore. In the 1800s, they don't believe in that, but now they're patronizing artists who have eccentric ideas. That's where now ideas become currency at
Ideas
this
become
time.
currency, and this is hugely important because this is what sparks the entirety of the Renaissance, right? We have two key moments that really spark the Renaissance in Italy, and that is we have the fleeing of the Greco-Roman pagan Gemistos Plethon from Byzantium to Italy. And he comes to Italy because he's terrified that the Orthodox are going to kill him and destroy his work. And he comes to Venice and he works with various noble families and helps establish the early schools of Greco-Roman philosophy. And this informs a lot of that occulted magic. Peter Mark Adams, in his book that he did on the Solabusca tarot called The Game of Saturn, argues that Gemistos Plethon is literally in the tarot, in the 10 of Cups. He appears as this face, So a lot of this pagan magic is really becoming hugely influential within the aristocracy of Italy at this time, and it's because of these rich Venetians and Ferrarese who are bringing these artists in and patronizing them. Gemistos Plethon fled, but the other big figure we have is, of course, the Italian Petrarch. Petrarch. And Petrarch was patronized again by high nobles to translate the works of Cicero into the vernacular. And of course, we have Bruno, who translates Socrates, but most importantly, from our magical perspective, he translates the Hermetic texts, which at that time they still believed in Hermes Trismegistus. They didn't see him as a daimonic figure or as a nom de plume. They believed he was a real guy from Egypt, So this is a really, that whole scene of the Renaissance is really, really interesting in terms of this high art, high culture that then informs so much of the art, and that becomes like what we see with Baudelaire and the Surrealists and Dada, all of that is born out of this Renaissance humanism.
Yeah, because no longer is it alchemy. In 1920, the alchemy is that camera projector.
Right.
That's the gold. That's the transfiguration. That's the miracle. That's the spark. Is magic is happening. Let's go to the next image because you're talking about Baudelaire, so that naturally we go to
talk about Poe, right? You cannot talk
I
about
know where
them
your mind's
separately.
at. I know where you're going.
Well, there is no Baudelaire without Poe. Like when I say he fangirled, like obsessively, he tried to channel Poe. He was terrified of translating much of Poe's poetry because he had it on such a level. He used to carry a bust of Poe around as an idol and worship the idol of Poe. So like Baudelaire was a true freak and a
And so
true
was
wizard.
Poe. And so
But
was Poe.
so was Poe. Poe was an alcoholic, a wild man. He, married to his cousin. There's
His
some pretty,
13-year-old cousin.
he was also a notorious liar and a charlatan. He claimed that he went and fought in Greece with Lord Byron. He claimed he knew Greek fluently. He was a consummate storyteller, right? But we also have to acknowledge this is the man who invented the modern mystery and the modern horror genre as we understand them, beyond influential, and someone deeply
And you know what? If I could say one thing, he didn't have that
no,
aristocratic patronage.
nope. This was, a middle class. He came from some semblance of wealth, like his family had wealth, but Poe was an orphan. He was. His life was a brutal one. And like most scholars believe, like how he died. The story is he got drunk at one of the, was hanging out at some party and then got his ass beat by people who were trying to force him to vote. Because he used to have these things where they would go and bring out these militias who'd go beat up the poor and the homeless and forced them to vote for specific candidates. And he got beaten by these guys and was thrown into a ditch after he voted and died.
Mm,
Right?
mm. Very
Just wild.
anticlimactic, his death.
Very anticlimactic. Yep.
Um,
But you know, constant conspiracies abound about his death, though. You know,
and he was fascinated with the dark side, but
absolutely.
he had a way of turning it into a, we never talked about the concept of a dime store novel or
Right. Penny
these penny
Dreadfuls.
dreadfuls. Yeah,
Right.
there's he was a master of taking the Gothic novel and turning it into a newspaper article or a short little story. He can put you into the dark or into the shadow world in a small story. He knows how to get you there fast.
Right. Right. And these became hugely popular, the ever imitated, ever ripped off, right? One thing I also want to talk about with Poe before we move on. Graham and I did a whole deep dive on our other podcast, Searching for Dragons. We did a couple on Poe, but specifically, I did one on his short stories, Ligeia and Morella, because anyone who's interested in the muse magic needs to go check this out. Both of these plays are about death and resurrection in summoning the muse. Ligeia is actually a Greek figure. It's a Ligeia is one of the siren, or is it means clear voiced, and I believe it's one of the sirens. But wild, or not one of the sirens though. Sorry, it's one of these nymphy type figures. This, you know. Anyway, he's deeply in this magical current, and it's hidden in all of his stuff. You know, there's all of this stuff. Like in Ligeia, he's doing opium and he's having these visions of his wife died, but then being possessed by another spirit and coming back to life. It gets into some wild magic imagery for sure, and quintessentially Gothic. You know, so much of Poe's imagery is like we're in these rotted, decaying castles. We're in this dark, deep, dank place. You know.
And that's part of the Gothic imagery. The 1700s, you'll see next week that's part of this world that these writers created, and it's a world of the rich person's world. It's the castle and the evil rich person doing things to you. You're stuck in their creepy dark world.
Right.
So at the same time that you have Poe in America, in France, you have Elphius Levi.
Right.
And I wanted to illustrate that outfit he's wearing because he was a priest for 20, 30 years before he became the, occult
The
author.
magical person. But he also, he famously, he has a entheogenic induced psychosis and breaks free of occultism in the end of his life, right? He's always a very deeply Christian man and a deeply Catholic man, but yeah. Say
and here he's wearing that black outfit. It's called a cassock. It's a long black priest robes. And he wore a long black robe for literally 20 or 30 years of his life before he got into the other things and, this Masonic stuff, you could say.
Martinism. So
Martinism.
French, he was into French Masonry, which is Martinism,
Martin de Pasquale and Saint Martin. We've talked about in previous episodes, which is and that stuff goes hand in hand with politics. Yeah. Hand in hand with politics, religion. And what he's famous for is the Baphomet, throwing up the Baphomet. Right. That goat you see giving the horn signs, that image.
Well, his book, A History of Magic, it's one of the most, it's probably the most influential occult work ever written. Aleister Crowley believed that he was the modern incarnation of Elphius Levi, which is kind of ridiculous. Like he clearly didn't know Elphius Levi. Yeah, you're the reincarnation of this deeply Catholic communist. I don't think so, Crowley. I do not think so.
Well, and that's the thing is that, remember our other episodes we did about the Great Game, which illustrated how a lot of these occult artists were also involved in espionage and spy stuff, like Crowley and Elphius. A lot of them, are connected to secret police, military. Just
But the
saying,
other major,
politics.
yeah, and the other major contribution that Alpheus Levi has to modern magic is he is, you know, people argue that the Marseille deck is a Jewish construction, that it comes out of the Jewish faith, and that and it interconnects with paganism and Christian ideas, and that iteration of the Torah is a retelling of the Torah, and that this is all there. Alpheus Levi, though, is the one who really goes into this, and he applies the Kabbalah. He's the first to really systematize the Kabbalah and the tarot, to synthesize them into a single product that then becomes the basis for the Golden Dawn system of the tarot, which is the most influential system of the tarot. Most, say 90% of all tarot in modern times is based upon the Golden Dawn stuff, and the Golden Dawn stuff is based upon Alpheus Levi. So
Yeah.
he's really hugely influential in that regard. He brought in a lot of this Christian and this Kabbalism into the tarot.
And this literature is during this period. So at the turn of the century, 1800s to 1900s, there's so much literature that these intellectuals have at their grasp, and it's a war
Right.
of ideas.
It's a war of ideas. We got to remember too, like, communism and anarchism, these are real ideas that are taking root at this time. And, Alpheus Levi was a devout socialist and was a radical revolutionary. And he raged against the anarchist occultists. He was raging against a lot of these more libertine aspects. And this is also something, again, like in our espionage episodes, we talked about this. These occult societies, they come in two forms, right? You get the Golden Dawn form, which are deeply connected to the nobility, and they're deeply connected to this idea of the royals, and are deeply, usually Christian influenced, and they're
Monarchy.
about maintaining, they're conservative, about maintaining the status quo, about a return to monarchy. The Golden Dawn, famously, right, they were trying to institute a fall of the British crown and a return of the Bourbon line. Like, they were deeply political. And the allegation against Crowley, right, which hasn't been proved, but, we believe Crowley was a pawn who was sent in, well, he was a spy sent into the Golden Dawn to destroy it, because they were this deeply monarchist, anti-British crown thing, but on the other hand, we do have these more radical, progressive secret societies. For example, the most infamous secret society of all time, which we talked about, Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati, which was really a progressive humanist organization that worked to enlighten people and tried to bring people into enlightenment and humanist values, tried to instill democracy and equality of the sexes. And this was their big revelation. And this was what was so terrifying to the nobility of Europe, which is why they had to cast a satire upon the Illuminati and turn it into this parody. And now it's become this evil boogeyman, when really this was a democratic humanist organization.
Yeah. Well,
but
it's boogeyman and secret societies. And this is like the 1850s. And this is like Alpheus, through his works, he wanted to influence politics and people's thinking. Well, if we go to the next image, there's another artist at this time.
I just also want to point out, just to drive it home, his fearful writing about all of these anarchist occultists, right, and his deeply communist kind of perspective, and this going against in his Catholic perspective, then informs A.E. Waite in his Satanic Panic literature, right? So at the same time, we were seeing the birth of Satanism kind of with Alpheus Levi, at least in terms of the aesthetics. We're also seeing the birth of the Satanic Panic with Alpheus Levi.
It comes with the pre-package, both together.
Right? So yeah, now let's continue. What's the artist here?
Wagner.
Oh, Wagner. Okay.
And this is the Flying Dutchman. And now Wagner, his work in himself, and Wagner was a student of philosophy, and he was into Rosicrucianism and what have you, secret society stuff, along with the church. And his works, his music is thought to be dabble in the dark side. Um, now
Well, we got
this
to
work
talk
right
a
here.
bit. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, what were you gonna say?
I said we got to talk a bit about, Germany at this time. You have the birth of sort of like what they call the Sturm und Drang, which is
Yeah.
this whole
Yep.
pre-romantic movement, but like Goethe and Schiller and Wagner, this high Germanic art, which is all about this kind of intense emotion, rugged individualism, and a return to nature, a rejection of sort of the Enlightenment values that preceded it, and rationalism, and this return to the mystical. At the same time, we're seeing this rebirth of paganism in Germany at this time. You get the magic circle movement, you get later philosophers like Ludwig Klages, but it begins here with the Sturm und Drang, this return to a nature, this return to the romantic, this return to the mythic with people like Goethe, Wagner, and Schiller.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in this one, the Flying Dutchman, notice his black iconic robe.
Oh, wow.
And like even the Jesuit order, they have that same look. They're known as the Black Robes. And it has power, the Flying Dutchman, and he's cursed because of Satan. He made a pact with Satan, and he can get redemption through a woman. Every 7 years, he gets a chance to come ashore and try to find a woman to fall in love with them. It says seduction with the dark side and redemption and love, like Dracula falling in love. In the modern Dracula, it's a redemption love thing. And here it's the Flying Dutchman, Wagner. And Wagner's famous for also the Devil's Interval, chords, tritones,
Right.
and
All of this
pagan
poetic
mythology.
stuff, the ring
Yeah,
cycle, right?
yeah.
High art, taking art to its breaking point, right? Like his orchestral works were just like the heights of decadence, and the heights
Mm-hmm.
of Germanic Empire culture, right?
And suppose his music could drive you crazy. It could whip you into a frenzy. Along with another artist at the same time. Go to the next image. Paganini.
Right. Now
The
we're getting
violinist who supposedly had a deal with the devil as well, way before the guy at the Crossroads had to deal with the devil.
Well, this is
Paganini.
where that specific, we can trace these kind of stories, of course, back to Lucifer Apollo, right? And Lucifer Apollo, specifically in the guy, in that more Greek image, is the god of music, the god of the lyre, the god of divination and prophecy. And he inspires people with the performance of great music, specifically on the stringed instruments. Orpheus is his greatest patron saint. And this whole thing about being able to perform on the lyre is such a quintessential magical thing, and by the time you get to Paganini, like Paganini is one of these quintessential showmen, a virtuoso of just untold skill, but also a performer. And he would play into these things when they called him like, oh, you must have sold your soul to the devil. He didn't deny it. He played it up, and he'd purposely make his compositions more ridiculous and used to do all these ridiculous tricks and flair, and this is the real beginnings of sort of the rock star, because at the same time you get people like Paganini, you also get Liszt. And there's
Yeah.
stories of women like taking their panties off and throwing them at Liszt after he would perform on the piano.
Yeah.
Just
Franz
wild
Liszt.
stuff, right? And there's always been this idea that inspiration and skill of that level has to come from this magical or demonic source, especially because it drives women wild, it drives men wild, it brings people to the banks of ecstasy.
And they said he was possessed by the devil when he played. And that when they said that only drove up his worth. Because remember, artists were patronized back then. You had to go to a rich person's house or a court somewhere, and they would take care of you. They give you a room and food and some money, and you'd maybe compose a piece for them or do one of your classics, drive everyone crazy. They get, drink some opium or some, what's the green one? Absinthe.
Right.
Wild
stuff.
And these are rock stars. This is goth. I mean, Paganini's as goth as you get. In all black, possessed by the devil, driving people crazy. the
Yeah,
European courts.
causing
Um,
people to go into fits of ecstasy.
yeah, yeah. Um, and when they said, asked him if he was the devil, he wouldn't deny it, or if he had
Yeah.
to deal with the devil, he didn't deny it. Let's hit the next image. All right, we're at 1837. Um, here's a novel. Um, how do you say it? Maprat. And it's by an author named George Sand. But George Sand, his real name is Amatine Lucille Aurore Dupont de Francois. Um, hit the next image. And here she is.
Oh wow.
Oh yeah. She dressed like a man and would
Interesting.
write these works. And some of them are that have gothic and subtones in it and characters. But her herself was a tough cookie. You know, she would go out in public with her husband and he would be dressed as a man and she would be dressed as a man too.
Radical for back then. Seriously radical.
Yeah. And
Radical
her,
for today, let's be honest.
yeah, even today, look at that image of her. I'm just saying, cold piece right there.
Right.
She, that's to me, that's gothic. That
Yeah.
represents the working with your shadow and confronting what's art and what's reality, the confrontation of the self. Because it's at the same time that we have some other novels out. I want to show you. Go to the next image. You know, before we even get to Shelley and Byron at the chateau, you know who came out with 1831 before them was Victor Hugo,
Oh
Hunchback of
wow.
Notre Dame. The
Right.
Hunchback of Notre Dame. That's
Yeah.
pretty gothic right there. It deals with the church. It deals with the gothic cathedrals and the sound and the possessing and a woman. There's a female character and there's love, and that seems part of the gothic romance is the dark side and redemption from a woman. Um, there's his terms, and so we'll go to 1816 when we had an event happen when Mary Shelley, Lord Byron,
Oops.
they yeah, there she is. They went in uh, to a chateau, I think in Geneva, and stayed. And that summer was called the Summer of Darkness because there had been a volcanic explosion on a different part of the planet that year, and this ash spread all through Europe and through certain parts, and it made it a dark during summer. And so it was called the Summer of Darkness or the Summer
Yeah,
Without
the
Light.
year without a summer.
The year without a summer. There you go. And so they're like, well, what are we going to do? Let's go get high and stay up at the chateau. And we'll each create monster myths and ghost stories and have a competition.
Yeah, she went there with her love, well, her soon-to-be husband, her lover at the time, Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, and I believe her cousin was there with them as well. Um, and the whole thing was they engaged in this, to try and pass the time. They agreed to each write horror stories to try and impress the other one. And Mary Shelley was the one who won. Hers was deemed the best story. I mean, this is also kind of a wild time for Mary Shelley. She's 18. She just had a miscarriage, and it was a brutal miscarriage. And she's also dealing with, you know, she's in this kind of libertine relationship with Percy Shelley, and Shelley has a wife at this time, and she's his lover, and it's like she's really, when you read and you look into Frankenstein, like Frankenstein to me is the quintessential Gothic novel, right? This is where it all comes together. And it's also the birth of science fiction. It's the first science fiction horror in the truest sense of the
Prometheus.
word, right? The modern Prometheus, you know, and it's combining all of these kind of magical elements. It's taking, instead of it being a wizard who does the magic, now it's a scientist using technology who does the magic. But the story is really about her reacting to her loss of her daughter, this child that she lost, and feeling like she failed, and also reacting to this idea of creation without a mother. What happens if you create life without the feminine? right? If you were to truly create something that was a truly technological life form that existed without that, and what if you had a life that experienced no love? You know, and that's really where Frankenstein comes in. And it's such a wild, wild, wild story. Byron is interesting because in the same party, he writes The Vampire, right? Which we were just looking at. And The Vampire is a short story, but it's kind of like the quintessential or the beginning of the romantic vampire. You have this noble and he's trying to seduce the young woman, right? In this particular story. But yeah, such a huge burst of creativity in this moment. Two of the most influential horror stories ever created, you know? And
And
also, we got to talk.
there's another
Go ahead.
author there that's Polidori. That was part of their
Polidori.
yeah, that was part of
Right,
their little set that helped define this vampire. Even though we'll find the vampire 100 years earlier, this is where it's takes on its immortalization,
right.
its romantic character, its seductive side. They
This
start the
is where we
seduction.
see we start to see the vampire that we know and love. You know, a lot of people go to Bram Stoker, but I would say no, it really begins with it's Byron who really brings us the vampires we know them, you know, which is
And
really
they're
interesting.
ripping off the Gothic novels from earlier,
They're
1700s.
ripping off Camilla, you know.
Yeah, and they could say like Anne Radcliffe, or so there's other people.
Right.
Um, so let's go to the next couple images.
Well, I just want to, before we go
Okay,
off,
yeah,
in terms of, we got to talk a bit more about Mary Shelley because she's one of the most important, you know, she's the goth mother. Most that like there's so much of the whole gothic idea spawns from this woman in reaction to her and her art. Um, you know, there's all these infamous stories about her because you got to remember, right? At the time that she was writing, the idea, when she first published Frankenstein, she published it under a pseudonym because she was afraid of the backlash from her family. Even though her family was ridiculously progressive, she was afraid of the backlash from English society, you know, because the idea of a woman writing a horror story, especially a young woman, this was like not seen as okay in any
right.
sense of the word. And after Frankenstein comes out and eventually it does become attributed to her, she becomes a notorious tabloid figure, right? Someone who's constantly brought up and talked about as this radical libertine who would be shamed in the news to sell papers. And some of these are stories that she tells that become embellished, but she plays into this too. Just like this is a constant thing we see with all of these characters where they're a radical, they become vilified, and then they celebrate the villainization. So there's one of the stories that we don't, you know, so Mary Shelley's mother died in childbirth, and she was always going to her mother's gravesite constantly throughout her life. And several times, her lover and her future husband, Percy Shelley, came with her. And she said that she made love to him in the graveyard. Well, eventually, this becomes a tabloid story where she lost her virginity on her mother's grave. You know, so they take it to the next level, right? And this just trying to show her as this ultimate goth figure. She lost her virginity on her dead mother's tomb. Like, what?
Mm.
And then later on, right, when Percy Shelley dies in a drowning, right? Traveling to Europe. And when they bring his body back, they find his heart had been calcified, turned into stone. And there's a fight over his heart, who's going to get it. And eventually Byron manages to secure it and gives it to Shelley, right? Well, Mary Shelley, she keeps it on her person, you know, and wraps it in a poem that was dedicated to her by him. And then eventually it's found in the desk by her son after she dies. And this becomes a whole tabloid thing. Mary Shelley kept the heart of her dead husband on her heart throughout her whole entire life. You know, there were all these stories. After Shelley died, for years, she wore black. But the myth takes on a greater story. They said that after Shelley died, she only wore black for the rest of her life, you know, because she becomes this tabloid figure and she becomes this kind of wild story. As much as Frankenstein is influential, the character of Mary Shelley is influential as this free libertine woman, this empowered woman. You know, her mother is Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the first and most important suffragists and feminist writers of all time. Her father was Godwin, who's this anarchist. You know, she comes out of radical stuff, and she's connected to the most radical people. She's married to Shelley. She's best friends with Byron, two of the most important romantic writers of the age. And her herself is the most important horror writer of all time. You know, so
Well, the fact that she wore black after is the bride who wore black. That's part of the title, is the
right.
concept of that. And also, you talked about the sexuality aspect. That's part of the libertine. You said the word libertine. Let's go to the next image.
I just want to say, oh, I almost forgot too. Her
Yep.
second novel is equally as important, which is The Last Man, which is all about the death of humanism and romanticism. But it's the first post-apocalyptic novel that imagines humanity dying, but nature continues. And we die due to our own hubris, killed by a virus of our own, you know, and our unwillingness to do anything about it.
That's where you get that Walking Dead genre, you know, post-apocalyptic world.
Post-apocalyptic worlds, right? And in that story too, it's also deeply magical. It opens up with her going to the cave of the Sibyls and finding these leaves that are written in English. And this is a magical prophecy from the Sibyls, the Greek prophets. And she takes this back and writes it, and it becomes The Last Man. So yeah, wild character, beyond influential. You know, the goth mother. We got to say it.
Well, I won't say he's the goth father right here, but
Oof.
he is arrested and tried for what's called libertine dementia. 1804, he was tried by the court system and put in jail. Marquis de Sade is very important in this because he did write Gothic tales. He had a book called Gothic Tales. And his Gothic Tales is way more sexual, obviously. Besides his impact on BDSM and sexual culture, libertine, it's because he had a budget. You know, he had a budget to do this stuff. But what I wanted to illustrate was that, power is that when he was put into jail and finally put into a mental institution, he was allowed to perform and write plays. So much so that they built a 200 seating amphitheater, or not amphitheater, performance theater for him to do his plays in. That it sat 200 people, and royalty would go, rich nobility, and they would watch his plays inside a mental institution. And he would do the craziest stuff. He would have regular performers, mental patients were part of the performances. He would use satire and politics mixed with sexuality and mental patients to critique the Napoleonic and the different stuff that's going on in France. And until finally they got him in trouble. They said, stop that. You can't do that. Then he went to the toilet paper, and he wrote with words that you have to use a magnifying glass to see. It's so small. And he wrote 120 days on toilet paper.
We got to understand, you know, like Marquis de Sade in our modern culture has become this almost, you know, romantic figure, celebrated as this person who really dedicated their life to pushing the boundaries to break free of that kind of Christian oppression. And, you know, there is that element to him, but he was also the worst human garbage. This is a man who believed in might is right and believed that he should be free to dominate and destroy the people around him as his playthings. And, you know, but there is, people celebrate, because what was 120 Days of Sodom all about? This was him trying to create the filthiest, most horrific, reactionary piece of literature imaginable. because he said, if you're going to try and silence me for writing filth, then I'm really going to give you filth. You know, I'm going to push this. And he was that kind of figure. And this was really important in terms of, you know, breaking free of that Catholic oppression within French society, of breaking free of all of this, you know, extreme morality. And we also have to understand, Marquis de Sade does not exist without the Catholic Church. He is a reaction to the Catholic Church. As depraved and as horrific as he is, he comes out of their intense moralizing, right? So much of his fetish is born out of the taboo, right? If these things are not taboo, if these things are not rejected, he doesn't engage in them. The only reason anyone is reading his filth is because it's taboo. Right?
It's
It's like,
libertine. And
you
part
know,
of
I
it,
tried to
I
read
would say,
120 days.
it,
I tried to read that
oh
120
no,
days.
that's too crazy. It's crazy. And
It's
if I could
just
say one
filth
thing,
upon filth upon filth upon
yeah,
filth. It's just as gross as humanly possible. It's not good writing. It's not interesting. It's just disgusting.
but there is a liberating aspect in
Yes,
pushing limits.
absolutely.
That's where he delivered this libertine thing. He's setting the stage for these other artists to give them permission
Yeah,
to do this stuff, good or bad.
good or bad. Because
You need
at the end of the
discretion
day,
and
it's just
responsibility.
at the end
He
of the
didn't have
day.
discretion or responsibility
No,
as the artist.
you know, Marquis de Sade was a horrible abuser and awful person, but you know, 120 Days of Sodom is literature. It's not real, you know? And we have to ask ourselves, you know, like how far can you push free speech? Right? How far can you push these things? You know? At what point do you stop it? Gets
Yeah,
wild.
no, they finally had to take his, they said, and his main weapon was his ideas. They finally had said, take his literary tools away from him. And that's when he started writing on the toilet paper. And they said, take that away. You can't, the man cannot have a pen. And the only reason that they even found that 120 days is because he hid it in the prison wall. And they found it years later, and his daughter hid it in the one of his family members hid it in a drawer somewhere, and they found it years later and published it. Because it was a scroll at that point. It was a long scroll that you needed a magnifying glass to see it. Because they wanted to take the tools away from him. He's deadly with the pen. His satire, his mind is deadly because it's just out of control. Out of control.
Control. You know, he was the ultimate libertine, ultimate, you know, ultimate about this decadence and the fulfillment of individual desire, right? Might is right. The domination and destruction of all those around him for his own personal fulfillment, right? As
And
dark as you get.
yeah, and what they called it at court was libertine dementia. He suffers from libertine dementia. Was what got him thrown in. That's the freedom of ideas.
Right.
You
But you
know,
know,
good or bad.
so much of all of our subculture is born out of this kind of reaction and born out of this desire to explore the taboo and the dark side, that which is fearful and ugly and evil, right?
And if you're not careful, you end up in a mental institution and getting your head cut off.
Yep. Right?
You know, that's what this is about, discernment and responsibility. That's why people are like, why so much of this dark side stuff? Because it's our shadow nature, and it's always been there through the ages. That's what we're showing. It's always there, creeping in the background, exciting people. The dark arts in the shadow, whether it's Paganini or it's Alice Cooper, there's always somebody there screaming, "Hey, what about your shadow?"
Right. One horror story that kind of really summarizes this, that, you know, it was also a film, is Hellraiser, right?
Mm.
Hellraiser to me is kind of one of the quintessential Gothic forms of media, because why? It really puts that whole left-hand perspective out there in all of its radical intensity. The Cenobites, the demons of that cube, they are offering you an experience, to experience the dark side, to experience the totality of what the human body can endure before you are destroyed and desecrated. And there is an attraction here, right? There is that lust unto death that is very, very human. We all feel this desire,
But isn't it a
you know, to
personal choice?
destroy.
Wasn't it a personal choice to
It is
Hellraiser?
a
They just don't pick
and
on
it's
anybody.
No, you have to go to the Cenobites and ask. You got
Ah,
to ask. You got to
open the
want
box.
to taste. Yeah, you got to break the puzzle and open the box. At least in the
Whoa.
original. Don't go to the remakes. Not good. They lose the quintessential magical element, which is this. You got to go to the dark side. You got to ask for a taste. And then almost always these people regret it. As they
Ah,
are ripped apart and brutalized. The dark side isn't always what you think it is.
our shadow nature. But once we, I can't say confront it or embrace it, but acknowledge, at least acknowledge.
Well, this is the problem, right? When we have these reactionary ideologies that create this dichotomy between good and evil, and they vilify and demonize aspects of human nature and human society rather than try to explain them within their context or have a nuanced discussion about them. When you turn things into this black and white and you vilify it, now it's taboo, now it's seductive, now it's erotic. You say I shouldn't, well fuck, I'm going to do it. This is baby stuff, like I'm a father now and I'm dealing with a kid and it's constant, you tell them not to do something, they're going to do it and they laugh. you
Mm.
know
I remember though, I did stick my finger in the fire and then I stopped doing it.
right.
They
You
told me
eventually
not to.
learn. You eventually the kid will learn to a certain extent, but there's always that. Can I push it? Can I?
Well,
There's fun and a thrill in the breaking of the rule. And if you tell someone that you can't do this and it's evil, someone's going to go, "Why? What do you mean? What are you talking about?"
why can't I touch fire? It looks so
Right?
shiny and bright and it's calling to me.
It's calling to me. You know.
Well, like, subscribe, share. We love comments. Next week we'll be back with more of this the dark arts and the gothic nature, a lot of gothic novels, gothic romance. And this is the height of it when we get to the 1700s and
We're going to talk about Goethe and Faust. We're going to get into
yeah,
some real wild
all that
stuff.
whole world. That's where and then it's not libertine. You weren't libertine then. You were everyone was Christian.
Well,
Everyone was Christian.
the libertine thing, as we were saying earlier, really comes out of that Renaissance humanism. So there is this libertine thing, but it's hidden within like there's all this debate. Like someone like Elizabeth Bathory, was she a libertine who was brutalizing the poor people around her, drinking and bathing their blood? Or was she a noble woman who was satirized and had her land stolen? Or was it both?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like there's a why, like, but there is always this noble abuse and insanity that it's at the heart of a lot of this literature, and a lot of this dark magic that's coming out, the decadence. You have to have wealth and power to engage in the decadence.
yeah. And it's during these ages that its literature is the driving force.
Yeah.
Whereas where we had music, records, and CDs, and we had movies and silent film, then we had theater. When we get to this eras, that's its literature. It's all literature based at this point, and except for some Shakespearean stuff. But
Right.
even Shakespeare was hiding things.
Mostly
We're
literature.
in the hiding era, when you get to the Dark Ages and everything. And
Right. Everything's got to be obscured and hidden. Everything is reserved within these secret societies and these upper echelons. It's only for the noble classes and the merchant classes. And they're constantly fighting with each other in these kind of occulted ways. It's wild shit. And painting, of course. Thank
yeah,
you,
the
Monsignor.
painting is
The art, right? Da Vinci, and we'll get into all that. The Renaissance art, right? That really
William Blake is
William Blake, of course, Francis Bacon. There's so many people that we're going to talk about still that really influence all of this radical culture. But yeah, this was so much fun. Goth is so much deeper than you thought. And the dark side has always been and always will be alluring, both good and bad, right?
yeah.
But yeah, so much fun. So thank you guys all for joining us. We really appreciate you. Give us a like and a subscribe, as Dion said. If we left anything out, if there's any quintessential Gothic characters or elements of media that you think that we need to talk about, please let us know. We had accidentally forgot, for example, Jimmy Page, and of course,
Betty
the other
Page.
Page, Eddie Page. But we had to bring him in. We had to bring him in, and it was thanks to our viewers. So please keep us informed. We are just as much explorers as we are presenters, and we're out to learn as much as we can about all these beautiful subjects. And we love the Gothic subculture. It's so fun. It's so interesting. And we like the dark side. It's fun. It's interesting. But we
Just
want
be
to
careful having fun.
exactly. We want to approach this like Odysseus. We observe the sirens, but we stay on the mast.
I'm staying on the boat. I don't know about you.
Right? Right? Exactly. All right, guys. Thank you so much. And any last words for our audience, Dion?
Oh, stay blessed. Have fun.
Stay blessed. Have fun. Explore art and the humanities. Read books. That's all we do. All right. Thanks, guys. Peace and love. Take care.